Since we have a fairly small group, can we just get a round of who's located where, or just, get a sense of where everyone's at tonight?
Sure.
Giuseppe, where are you located?
Mexico City.
Okay. Neighbors.
Mexico too.
You could say that, yeah.
All right. Mexico City strong tonight.
Go ahead, Andres.
Mexico.
¿Qué parte de México, Andrés?
Mexico City, sorry. I muted
Vale,
it.
Mexico. Okay.
And Raimundo's in Mexico, last I heard as well.
Okay.
Yes, it's a very noisy situation. Sorry.
Amazing. So again, welcome everybody to another episode of Landa Talks, where we chat with experienced consultants to share a bit about their story, as well as practical tips learned in their journey. We're going to host Abby in this one. Abby is a full-time fractional COO, and also we're happy to have her as part of Landa. She's part of she's member of cohort number 5, correct, Abby?
Correct.
So I think, again, thanks a lot for taking the time to share your experience with us. A little bit about the structure. So usually what we do is 20 to 30 minutes, just Q&A, me and her at this point. And then we'll leave about 10 to 15 minutes in the end for questions from the audience. As we go, if you have any other questions you want to start laying out in the chat, that'll be fine. And then in the end, you could just unmute yourself and send her the question, okay? And start asking her directly. Does that work for everybody? Amazing. So Abby, first question, I guess, that we would like to ask every one of our guests is, can you please introduce yourself to the audience? That would be amazing.
Sure. So I'm actually Abigail. If you call me Abby, that's totally fine. But most people know me as Abigail. I am originally from the Northeast of the US. I originally started my career in social venture capital and mission-driven organizations in international development, and worked in a really scrappy environment very early on. Was put in charge of running global talent and for worldwide offices straight out of undergrad, and had about $1 million of a budget to do it. I decided after a little while of that I really wanted to be more into the nuts and bolts of running and building for-profit businesses. And so I made a pivot, went and did an MBA at Columbia, and then coming out of MBA, went into traditional management consulting, Fortune 500 companies for about 4.5 years after business school. And I can't say that it wasn't like a fish out of water, because I was really like the scrappiest one on the team, but I got a huge amount of rotations and a lot of analytical chops that I wouldn't have gotten any other way. And a real operational focus. Though what I learned there is that operations is like the big circus tent, and people just like throw everything under it. So operations is a lot of things to everyone. And then after Fortune 500 management consulting, I went back in the direction of high growth startups and was in-house in various roles like chief of staff, head of expansion operations, lots of strategy and operations stuff for anywhere from seed to Series C startups in New York for about 4 years. That really felt like 15 years or more in terms of the amount that I saw and did and built. And coming out of that, I decided in early 2022 to go fully independent and fractional and do chief of staff and COO type work with early stage startups independently and full time. So I can get more into why the transition and what I've been up to for the last 1.5 years. But that is a little bit about me. I'm currently in Mexico City, and I split time between Mexico City and wherever else I need to be for client work. And I'm often back in New York as well. So that's me.
Amazing. And great segue to maybe go a little bit deep into that, right? Like, how did you go into fractional work? And more specifically, can you tell us about the story of getting your first client? That's always a very interesting piece.
Yeah, so actually this is a good one, because my very first client technically was a founder who was actually a very good friend. We had spoken about me joining his team. I was in between startup roles at the time, realized that actually I would be a terrible, like it would destroy our friendship to join his team full time. But we could mutually help each other in the meantime. And so I did some temporary fractional work in building an operating model, a hiring strategy, rescuing the customer success team and restructuring that entirely, and doing just a lot of stuff that lacked ownership on his leadership team at the time. And while that was not fully fractional and I went back in-house after that, it was the first sort of clue to me that actually this type of setup can be huge value add in a really short amount of time. And then I guess to your question of why did I go fully fractional? It's a lot of learnings from having been in-house with high growth startups, but mainly I felt that the places that I shown the best, all the value that I had added came from being able to be very cross-functional, extremely flexible, to be very focused on what is on critical path that's not being owned, and go around the organization and build it or fix it, own it, figure out who else needs to own it, and then transition it and move on. And I recognized also that, as I got more experienced as a startup operator, I started realizing that in my community of operators, there were certain themes that were popping out. And a lot of us who were working in startups, like this amazing and really inspirational mythology around the successful exit, the Ubers, the Rappies. But if you do the math, the likelihood that your startup and you as a common stock options holder are going to actually have that massive payout, they are not 50-50. They're not even 1 in 10. So it was a realization that in order to diversify and manage personal risk, career risk, and financial risk, all eggs in one basket might not be the right strategy, and being able to deploy in a really flexible, high impact, hard charging way with these startups would be a way to be able to work in the same environment, but also diversify my own risk. So, and it's just so much fun. So yeah, I would also add, we did a survey of senior operators, and the average tenure for a senior operator in whatever stage startup on average is about 2 years. The average vesting time for equity is 3 to 4 years. The cliff is 1 year. And for chief of staff roles, the average tenure is less than 18 months. So if you think about it, you're actually going to spend a lot of time between roles, and flexibility is actually really beneficial when you're making these kind of executive hires. So that's how I got here.
That's amazing. And I guess you mentioned you were, a management consultant in the past, and they do a lot of, project-based stuff, and you're doing fractional executive, decisions, which are very different. They're integrated to the company. So maybe briefly, can you explain, I guess, like the difference between these two models, and potentially maybe like pros and cons between the two? That would be super interesting.
Yeah, I kind of think of it as you have consulting, which is project-based, whether you're independent or on a team. Often you're ancillary to the team, you're additional, but you are still a bit at arm's length. You're not embedded with the team. You don't represent the company usually. And the big difference is that the company has been able to hopefully fairly clearly scope what it is they actually want you to do. And it's time bound, and there's a price tag on it. And often there's also a high amount of subject matter expertise that they're looking to bring in that they don't have. But they already kind of know, or they think they know, what it is you're going to deliver. And you don't have direct management responsibility over their team members, usually. Again, there are all sorts of exceptions. I think the flip of that is with fractional executive work. Often your value add at that level of seniority is that you will help them scope, you will help figure out what the deliverables are, you will help actually do the strategic planning and the priority setting and the priority resetting and the performance accountability, and lead junior teams and represent the company. You're really kind of a co-builder, but you're more of a flexible resource because they may not need you full time. And they only may need you for a short amount of time. So that's how I think about it. It's like embedded, not embedded, well-scoped, subject matter expert, time-bound, versus you are on their leadership team and you are fully embedded.
Makes a lot of sense. And Giuseppe, if you don't mind, would you mind taking the question at last? Amazing, just to keep the structure. And also a good segue, Abigail, to go through, how do you go through these conversations, right? Obviously, like, you know, you're talking about the very senior position, which usually is very hard to scope out in a proposal, right? So how do you handle these chats with like prospective clients, right? And just defining what you're going to do or not going to do. I'm curious to hear more about that.
So I think this is going to be pretty specific to the role of COO. It's actually kind of co-builder. Some people think of it as the operational co-founder that they probably don't have. All of these conversations are usually directly with the CEO or potentially a COO if they've got one, or with an investor or an advisor. So that's the audience that I'm talking to. And the conversations usually, there's a lot of ways in, but often they'll be thinking, oh, we are looking to hire a full-time role, or I'm looking to hire a head of operations, but I don't really know what level I'm looking for yet. Or I just raised money and now I got to get to the next level and I do not have the team to do it. Or I've got some gaps on my leadership team right now and I'd love to talk through that with you. These are all these kind of like flags that pop up. And what I often end up talking with them about is what their current priorities are. And like, all right, where do you need to be in 3 to 6 months? What will great look like? What are the things that are not being owned right now or are not moving fast enough? And then I see if I can kind of draw parallels with other work that I've done or just experience I have in various industries, and say, what I'm hearing from you is that these are your gaps. And here are ways that I think I can help. And here are places where I wouldn't be the right person to plug in for this. Maybe you do want to hire a consultant, or maybe this is not as high priority. But some of the pushback that I get, and I think this is even more probably to go into, is they'll be like, well, I could hire a slightly more junior resource full time, or I can have you not even part-time. Why would I do that? And my answer to that is, every time I've worked or been approached by second, third, fourth time founders who have often successfully exited, they seek out the most senior, the most self-directed, the most thought partnery person they can afford and find to plug in at any given minute, so long as they are flexible and they can roll them up and down as needed. And they don't want to have to spend twice or 3 times as amount of the time to manage this other resource to get where they need to go, because time is so precious at these stages of companies. So that's kind of one thing that I talk through a lot with them. And I think the other is just the realization, 60%, people don't like to talk about this, but 60% of senior exec hires in startups do not work out past 1 year. The fail rate is very, very high. And there's all sorts of reasons for that, right? The company is moving fast, founder fit, career expectations, the company doesn't do well, you got, tons of reasons why. But if you think that it takes 3 to 6 months to hire that person. Meanwhile, you're not getting anything built or done. Things are falling by the wayside. You've got operational debt building, missed opportunities, opportunities left on the table. And then you got to worry about retaining that person or whether they work out. Wouldn't it be great if you could just start 2 weeks in from now or 1 and try before you buy and get a lot of value in a short amount of time and then flex up and down as things change. So I think this model actually, people say, oh, fractional executives, much better when you have a lot more resources, when you're later stage, bigger company. And actually, the value of flexibility is even higher at the early stages. So that's a lot of what I spend time kind of trying to steer people in the direction of understanding about the value of fractional work for early stage companies.
Makes a lot of sense. Yeah, and you covered a lot of ground around the main objections in these kind of calls. So thanks a lot for bringing those up. And you also touched upon your ICP right now and defining which companies you're targeting right now. There's always like a thorough process that starts somewhere and then like kind of ends somewhere completely different. I'm curious to hear about that process for you, right? Like, what did you think was the right customer for you in the beginning? Does that match what it is right now? What did that process look like? Curious to hear more about that.
Yeah, I think what I have been able to do is to kind of distill 3 different flavors of how I can plug in. And I think when I started, I had more of like a Chinese menu of offerings of like, I could build you this, I can build you that, I can do biz ops, I can do customer success, I can select your accounting and finance research. Like I can do all these things. I can build you a data architecture. Like it's just people are like, I need all these things, but I don't know when or how. Instead of pitching it that way, the way that I kind of frame it now is that I can be the embedded leadership team member that you are missing to free up founder bandwidth so that the founder can focus on what they are truly good at and things still get built. And, we're really building V1 of the company. That's the embedded fractional COO offering. Pretty agnostic, honestly, of industry. But the second offering is you have a new market or a new product, or you need something quarterbacked, and basically you need an interim GM to own something that you don't really know what it looks like yet. And you don't really want to commit to building a team around it until you pilot it or you spin it up. And so I can help basically own that, quarterback it, spin it up, and then decide with the rest of the team how it's run in the future. And then the third way that I frame it is, a lot of founders either don't even and can't afford an embedded person, but they really would like that operational thought partnership. And so I do advisory. So, all right, I can spend 1 hour a week, 2 hours a week with you, kind of being your operator and strategic thought partner on how to keep setting goals, prioritizing, aligning resources, and do that as an advisory partner.
Makes a lot of sense. And one thing I wanted to touch upon as well is just because you're doing this, full time, is a question around, I guess, like time management locked in with lead generation a little bit. But how are you balancing your time right now between these, 2 activities of like actually working with the clients plus always do a little bit of prospecting? I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
This is definitely the nut I haven't cracked yet. To be completely honest, when I'm busy, I'm in the work. I have I'm just like so in it, and I just don't have a thought for really doing a lot of business development. And when then I'm not busy, I have to go rebuild pipeline, and it's most people who do this kind of work don't love business development. The balance I think I'm beginning to find is table stakes, make time for the excellent networks and meeting people in person that I'm already part of, and doing that not only is like building greater networks, but also just letting people know what I do and how this works, and not even just selling, it's just like making sure that this kind of concept gets out there. Playing leadership roles in some of the communities I'm part of to get people together. And then just taking anything that really comes my way. Like if someone's like, hey, I think you should talk to this person, I'm like, oh yeah, let's do that. Would I have more bandwidth, or I am fully focused on business development? It's all about personal network. All of it. I have been in touch with a number of VCs, so they're a good source. But I know there's a lot of recommendations. It works for some people to do personal branding, LinkedIn presence, produce content, that kind of stuff. I'm sure that would be very beneficial, but I'm still going after the lower hanging fruit and the stuff that I'm frankly just personally more comfortable with, which is the sort of the more intimate network.
Yeah, amazing. Whatever works for you as well. And I guess good segue to ask, what do you see for your future, right? So, you know, do you see this evolving into a point in which potentially you could bring a partner that takes on a little bit more of that BD side? I'm curious to hear how, I guess, like your career as a consultant looks in the future. Do you see yourself partnering with somebody? Is there like an agency route to it? I'm just curious. Or do you want to stick to the same thing? I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I think the question there is, does this ever become scalable? What I do is inherently not scalable. I am the product. And I think where there's leverage is either in creating a tight-knit band of people who do the similar work, so that business development can be more of a joint channel, and we can pass around things when people can't immediately take up bandwidth. And I already do this, bringing on other fractional people to plug in ways that I can't. So fractional CMOs, fractional CFOs, fractional product people. And there it becomes more like you get me, and this offering, but you also get kind of this idea of a well-vetted network to also plug in other ways. I think, long-term, I'm really enjoying this. I love it. It's so exciting. I get to see so many different things. It's wild. The risk is high, but the amount of impact added in such a short amount of time, and the feedback loop that is so tight, because, if I'm not adding value, you don't want to pay me. And we're like, great, there's another way to do this. And, but just knowing like how much you're valued and adding on a week-to-week basis for me has been really exhilarating. The exposure to multiple companies at the same time. And I don't know if it's sustainable long-term, but there's also this element of try before you buy, and there's always an open door to things working out and going in-house potentially as well. So TBD.
No, that's life, right? So I fully agree. You'll see when you'll see. And also you went through, I guess like one of the cons around consulting, which is the scalability issue, right? I guess a very broad and general question, but having been in this path for a while, what are some of the pros and cons you're seeing right now, or what would you say to like future consultants or somebody who's like exploring this route?
Yeah, I think right now in the last year, so shortly after I started trying to do this full-time, dedicated, there was an absolute flood into the market of talent coming out from all the tech layoffs. And I think a lot of people are in this, I'm going to consult, I'm going to go fractional, I'm going to do this more out of necessity or as a temporary thing. I do think that there is actually a fairly specific and special skill set to doing fractional executive work when you do it well. And I think it's actually pretty specific to the people who are going to enjoy it as well. And I think there's a lot of other types of consulting roles that are more specific to subject matter expertise, that are a little bit more project bound. There's a huge amount of work to be done there, but I think the market has been tricky for the last year or so in VC-backed world. It is seeming to ease up a little bit now. Sure that answers your question, but yeah.
Amazing. Yeah, and just closing out with the last one, which is, if you had to choose one advice for future consultants, like with your experience, which obviously there's like peaks and valleys, there's a lot of things to be learned. One practical advice that you would leave members of Landa with.
Yeah, I think this actually goes for any role, but more and more and more for consulting and for fractional exec is do not have your client manage you. Your value add is half managing your client, whatever that looks like to you. Some of the earliest feedback I got from my first clients was, all the stuff we did this pilot, we spun this up, we got product in market, but at the end of the day, the founder was like, what I really appreciated was that you managed me and you made it very clear where we were trying to get to, and basically quarterbacked me as a founder or me as a leader as well toward these overall business objectives. So it takes a lot of different formats, but even if you're fairly junior and a subject matter expert and delivering something, the more you can manage the other side of things, that multiplies your value add. Oh, and I have one other. Do not underprice yourself. Do not underprice yourself. I see the temptation all the time. I was super tempted at the beginning. I did it once. I learned, and then I really learned like what I was worth. And I just say like don't second guess in that regard.
Amazing. Yeah, thanks for the extra advice. So we're going to open it up to the audience. I don't know if maybe Giuseppe, sorry I cut you off a little bit early. I don't know if you want to start off with a question.
Sure. Coming from thanks. First of all, thanks very much for what you already explained to us. Coming from someone who doesn't have an experience in fractional senior management roles, the first question, and there are a couple of smaller questions related to that, is what is typically the legal framework of the relationship? Because you said you represent the company. Is it normally an external consultancy job, even if you're embedded, or are you an employee? And the reason why I ask you that is typically CFOs of companies they have a series of fiduciary duties. Among them, they tend to sign the accounts, the statements of the company, which is a whole different ballgame if you want to charge them for that, for the risk you're taking on a company that you never worked with before and you don't know the people there. So that's the first question. The second question is that you mentioned the probability of monetizing your equity. So I assume that the market pays some sort of cash component as opposed to equity, because I was in a call today with a startup, and they were swearing they want to attract a co-founder, and they were swearing that people would go for equity. And I was arguing, well, give it a try. I don't think anyone today, well, at least based on my experience, would join an unknown company just for equity on a pre-seed stage in that case. And the last one is that do you normally work under an exclusivity agreement, considering that the COO role is a very sensitive one, or can you be CEO of multiple companies? Sorry, I tried to jam everything so that you get rid of me in the first round.
It's okay. And I will, I'm going to just be clear. I'll speak to this from a strictly US employment and legal basis. I have not actually had any clients outside the UK and the US. So LATAM will be entirely different. To your first question, what does the legal structure look like? Very true that often CFOs or fractional CFOs that I see in this space, or COOs that are going to handle a lot more of the financial aspects, will have a different type of agreement and sometimes will take equity and will be employees, but they are on a fractional basis. That is actually not the structure that I use. I am technically a contractor. I have my own S Corp. So I have a bunch of overhead that I have to take care of on my side. But for legal reasons, for tax reasons, this is the way that I have decided to set it up. And I also, just given that I'm not a finance expert and would usually want to bring in someone to help with that expertise in terms of accounting or backing a fundraise, things like that, I usually don't sign on behalf of the company or take fiduciary responsibility. When I said represent the company, it's more I can be the external face of saying, I am going to be one of the main decision makers in this, or speak to potential partners or go out and represent the company in that way. So my structure is on a contract basis. I actually, there's 6 ways to Sunday to set these things up. I see every single person I know in this act does it slightly differently. There are retainer agreements. There's I do hourly floors and caps so that we build in more flexibility. There's monthly rates. There's, I do not do project-based, and I don't do flat fee, more because it allows us to really decide where I'm best deployed. And I really know that my time is being used well, and that they're getting benefit from it. So I go on an hourly basis. Does that cover legal structure-wise? Then I'll get to the next 2. Okay. Yeah. So actually, let's jump to the exclusivity question. I think I'd have to look into my standard contract, but I usually sign NDAs that the company gives me. Whether those are enforceable or not depends on your market. And non-competes, I do not allow non-competes, but I do. The reason you would hire me is that there is a high level of trust. And you have to believe that if I know all the things a COO would know, that like the value of having me there is that I can be part of personnel decisions. I can be part of financing decisions. I can be part of everything, and I can see everything. And then I am not gonna, take that anywhere else because it would destroy my credibility. So if I went and said to the next client, yeah, I know some like benchmarks that's like internal information from there, somebody else in your space, that should be a red flag to them that like you should not hire this person, because the amount of trust that is required in this role is extremely high. So a lot of things in this space operate on a trust basis. You can have all the contracts you want and sign everything, and at the end of the day, frankly, it just comes down to personal credibility. And to your third point on the cash or equity, this is a conversation I have all the time, for both people trying to hire fractional people and trying to hire full-time in the companies that I work for. I do believe that the preference for cash versus equity has shifted remarkably in the last couple years, probably. Since COVID, since people needed to be more mobile, since a lot of realizations about down rounds and what the likelihood of a successful exit looks like. And these things. That said, there's still a huge market for co-founders who want the equity and who want that ownership and who are willing to blood, sweat, and tears, sweat equity to build something. I do think it's a really personal choice about where you are career-wise, where you are financially, what your risk tolerance is. I don't take equity from the get-go. I look at equity as something that maybe is more of a retention for my support, skin in the game, or part of actually stepping into a full-time in-house role eventually. But I am very, very a big believer in the try before you buy model. And I think part of that is really being paid for your time as you do that.
That's great. Thanks very much.
Cool. Anybody else wants to jump in? I don't know if Rai, Amaury, any questions pop up? You're good? That just
Well,
means
thank you all answered.
super
Yeah.
clear, Abigail.
Oh, come on. There's going to be other fun questions.
I guess anything else you want to touch on, Abigail, before we leave? Anything maybe you realize there's like a third tip before we leave?
I think if I had it to do over again, I would have started doing this much sooner and much earlier. And my process would have been to really latch onto a few like highlights or things that leaning into flexibility, which was hard to explain to people at the time. But I've become more and more and more attuned to the value of that. And I think I had a hard time. Like, one of the things that I felt was hardest was to go out and talk to people about my niche, right? Or my offering. And as soon as I started doing that, I got a lot of good feedback. And I started learning by doing what was resonating, what wasn't resonating. And it was hard at the time to say, I'm doing this thing and you might want it, or you just might be interested in hearing about it. But it turns out a lot of people were. I'm still doing that, but I didn't start really making progress until I actually got out there and started talking to people about it, and doing it really seriously. So we just leave people with that.
Amazing. Well, thanks a lot, Abigail, and everybody else for joining. I'm going to stop the recording now. And yeah, have a great rest of the night. I guess everybody's in Mexico, so have a good night.
Thank you.
All right.
Thanks very much.